famous for its 10 points of Seelisberg, which was a major breakthrough in Christian theology towards Jews and Judaism. But I will actually not speak tonight about the 10 points of Seelisberg. Maybe we'll discuss it later on if there are questions about it. But my focus actually is on why Seelisberg and the 10 points of Seelisberg actually came into being, and who were the people there, and what was the motivation behind. Because, as we know, we are in truly historic times, one can say, because we do have now a dialogue between Christianity, several Christian churches, and Judaism, several Jewish denominations, on all levels actually. And that is kind of normal for us today, but it is actually an exception in Christian Jewish history. For most of the time, for nearly 2 millennia, Christians and Jews were whatever, either sometimes maybe more or less ambivalent, but not in a real dialogue and in the friendship we share in these days. Now, why did dialogue start at the end of the 1940s? Why in that time? And how did it develop, and who were the pioneers? This is actually more or less the lecture about. To better explain you the situation before the times of dialogue, I want to show you one quote from the Freund Israels. That was by the Association of the Friends of Israel in Basel. So when they called themselves Friends of Israel, obviously you can see they consider themselves pro-Jewish. It was actually a Jewish missionary organization, a Christian missionary organization trying to baptize Jews, bring them to Christianity from the Protestant church, actually, in Switzerland, in Basel. Now, anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish theology was the norm in the 19th centuries and also the beginning of the 20th century. And I think this one quote tells more than 1,000 words. I could bring many examples that it was really deeply embedded both in society and actually also within the churches. Now, if you can see that also those who even considered themselves friends of the Jews had an anti-Jewish theology and even mixed with other anti-Semitic stereotypes, you can imagine what about those who did not like the Jews. Now, I want to quote that. Godless Jewry is, wherever it settles, the fungus in the wooden rafters of the house of the people, the bacillus in the decay in the state organism, some riots and pogroms, which we absolutely reject and disapprove of because they are against the spirit of Christianity, were self-inflicted by some Jewish circles. While faithless Israel is destined to be a curse for the nations, the renewed and converted Jewish people will be a blessing to the world. So that was a typical theological position. The last point, the Jews who would be the new Israel would be converted of course to Christianity. They would be a blessing to the world. That is the interpretation of Zechariah, of the prophet. But the faithless Israels, those who do not accept Jesus as the Messiah, they will be actually a curse for the nations. We can see, however, that even this anti-Jewish theological position is mixed up with the typical folkish Nazi language, because when it says this, the Jewry is the fungus in the wooden rafters of the house of the people, the bacillus of decay in the state organism. This is actually what the Nazis and other propagated actually at the time. And it's interesting that the author here says that riots and pogroms are kind of self-inflicted by some Jewish circles. So the Jews are more or less themselves the problem, so they should actually change. And on the other hand, as a Christian, of course, they reject and disapprove it, because any kind of violence is against the Christian understanding. So we can see there is a way out for the Jews, and that is to become good Christians. Yeah. Well, from a Jewish point of view, this is nevertheless not very positive, even though these circles were definitely fighting against racial anti-Semitism. Now, this is an example from Protestantism. Don't think that the Catholic Church was much different. I don't want to go into detail here, but there are many examples that I could bring that especially the Catholic Church, that was very clearly against any form of racial anti-Semitism, was nevertheless in many ways not only theological anti-Jewish, but also anti-Semitic. For example, the Catholic, there were Catholic encyclopedias in Germany that defined anti-Semitism, and they kind of made a difference between, let's say, a good anti-Semitism and a bad anti-Semitism. The bad anti-Semitism is the racial anti-Semitism of the Nazis, and the good anti-Semitism is, for example, if you are against too much influence of the Jewish people into the culture or in the economy, or in such things as liberalism and internationalism and communism, which was linked to the Jews often. So you can see generally it was difficult. Now, obviously, there was maybe an interaction, but there was no real cooperation and dialogue between Christians and Jews, Christian and Jewish organizations. There might have been personal contacts and friendships and so on, but there was no official cooperation. Now, why did it change? It actually did change in the 1930s and the 1940s. It did change, however, not everywhere in Europe, but it was especially, I want to bring two examples, Britain and Switzerland. And Britain and Switzerland are not randomly the beginnings, one might say, of Christian-Jewish dialogue in Europe, but there is, of course, a history to it. First of all, those two countries were strongly democratic, liberal democracies, and they actually did not follow a mainstream that was kind of spreading all over Europe with authoritarian, fascist, or national socialist regimes, which were actually anti-democratic and very often also anti-religious in their outlook. Hitler's rise to power gave, of course, a new quality, and later on, of course, also the Second World War, because Hitler dominated Europe and the Nazi ideology was spread all over Europe. This meant two things. First of all, at that time, latest at the 1940s, dialogue was nearly not possible in Europe, only in Switzerland, which remained neutral. And in Britain, for example, it created a new sense of unity because the British were against Hitler and were together with the Western allies, with the Allied powers. Now, to go issues, a refugee problem, which means there were refugees coming to, for example, Switzerland and Britain, and it had to be organized. Now, what kind of refugees were there? First of all, there were Christian refugees, for example, those who were members of the confessing church or other church opponents in Germany. There were those Christians who were so-called non-Aryan Christians, which meant they were actually Jews who were baptized, or they might have been Christians, but one or two of their parents were originally Jewish. and therefore they were racially not considered Christian or Aryan. But there were also Jewish refugees. So in that sense, there was a refugee work by Christian organizations and also by Jewish organizations, and it quickly developed actually. They developed a cooperation. And then, of course, the 1938 pogrom night, the Kristallnacht or Crystal Night, showed the real dimension of anti-Semitism in Germany. Many church people were shocked. Christians were shocked by the pictures and news from Germany, because that was not anymore a discrimination of Jews, but that was the beginning actually of even not just like a policy against Jews, but the beginning of the extermination of the Jewish people. To just bring up a little example, there were many resolutions, supportive resolutions coming from different churches throughout the 1940s. One example is from the Methodist Church of Great Britain in July 1943. Just want to quickly read it. The conference affirms that anti-Semitism is utterly incompatible with the Christian doctrine of man and is a denial of the Christian gospel. Accordingly, the conference calls upon the Methodist people everywhere to resist attempts to rouse antagonism or prejudice against the Jewish people. The conference urges His Majesty's government to take every possible step to rescue men, women, and children of the Jewish race from their oppressors and to offer sanctuary in Great Britain. So we can see the Nazi Germany as the enemy brought Jews and Christians together, Jewish organizations and Christian organizations. The last paragraph here, we can see in refugee work, Jewish and Christian organizations started to work together. That meant, of course, that Jews and Christians also met and became friends or trusted each other. And that, again, intensified the relations between Jews and Christians. But we can also see that they say for the first time that anti-Semitism is not compatible with Christian doctrine, and that's actually a denial of the Christian faith. So we can see also it's not only a question of politics, but it also starts to become a question of theology. In Britain, a council of Christians and Jews was founded in October 1942. There were actually already many corporations beforehand, and there was also a society of Jews and Christians in London for some years. But in October 1942, so already during the war, this Council of Christians and Jews was founded in England, and it was actually supported by all the major churches and Jewish organizations. So the co-presidents were actually the Archbishop of Canterbury for the Protestants, the Archbishop of Westminster for the Catholics, and the Chief Rabbi of Britain for the Jewish side. And in their founding
Josh, are you there?
Was there a...
We lost you for a moment. So please go back.
Okay, so maybe, yeah. All right.
10 seconds.
I'll repeat the quote now. In the forefront of their efforts to create division within every community, the Nazis have always placed anti-Semitism, which is repugnant to the moral principles common to Christianity and Judaism alike. We cannot afford to ignore the effects of the steady propagation of this evil throughout the world. It is not only a message to the unity of every community in which it takes root, on which alone we believe that a new and better world can be established. So we can see also here the Christian and Jewish cooperation was on the one hand a political thing because, for example, the British churches and also the government, they did not want that the British society would be split. They were going for a unity of the British community in their effort against Nazi Germany. On the other hand, we can see also in these times of crisis, it brings people together and also shows that there are common moral principles in Christianity and Judaism. So actually, the Nazis are the natural enemy of not only the Jews, but also Christians. And on the other hand, Christianity and Judaism are automatically kind of allies because they share moral principles. And if we want to have a future, a new and better world in Europe, it can only happen if religions are actually working together. Similarly, actually, in Switzerland. In Switzerland also, for example, Karl Barth, a very famous Protestant theologian, was writing a memorandum, "Salvation is from the Jews." That's a quote from the Gospel of John in 1938, under the impression of the Crystal Night, of the Pogrom Night in 1938. And he writes there, "In the German plague of anti-Semitism, in the destruction of the Jewish synagogues and Torah scrolls, in the intentional physical extermination of the Jews, there is a deep struggle against the God of the Jews. And because the God of the Jews is also the God of Christians, the church is therefore also under a fundamental attack." So Barth and others understood also from the experience in Germany, from the church struggle, that maybe the Jews are the first victims, but they will not remain the last victims of the Nazi regime. The National Socialism is an evil regime against all kinds of religion, against God. If it's against the God of Israel, it's automatically also against the Christianity and the Christian God, because it's the same God. It's basically also the same principles. Now, this means, or he understands it, that Jews and Christians actually have to work together and protect each other against those evil forces. By the way, Barth also said in this memorandum that if the Germans would do as Pharaoh did to the Jewish people in the Bible, it will also have no good ending. It will also end in catastrophe, as the Pharaoh and Egypt ended in catastrophe in the Bible. And actually, it remained correctly at the end of the World War. So what did we have for further developments in Switzerland? There was the foundation of the Swiss Relief Organization for the Confessional Church in Germany and the Swiss Central Office for Refugee Aid. This was all done by the Protestant churches. And there was also established the Refugee Service of the World Council of Churches in Geneva. Originally, when it was founded in 1938, it was actually in London, but then it moved to Geneva when Nazi Germany declared war to England because they were afraid Britain might be occupied. So we can see through this refugee work, which started actually to support different church people from Germany, refugees, as I said, also from those Christians who were of Jewish descent. Quickly afterwards, they were starting to see that there's also a big need of help for Jewish refugees, and they were working together with the Jewish organizations who were also founded and who were fighting against anti-Semitism. Now, similarly, there were Catholic circles in Fribourg, in the Swiss town of Fribourg, around the later Cardinal Charles Jaunet, and also de Menasque, who's maybe known to some of you, who also supported on the one hand, Jewish refugees to Fribourg specifically, and on the other hand, who were actually trying to fight anti-Semitism within Switzerland, but also in France, for example. They were supporting Catholics in France who were in the resistance. They were trying to bring refugees in from different camps in France, and they were also protesting against the deportation of Jews from France. And finally, all these works, I mean, I could speak hours about it, but we don't have so much time. I'm sorry if I have to quickly go further from point to point, sometimes jump very quickly. This led to a foundation of a Christian-Jewish organization, the Christlich-Jüdische Arbeitsgemeinschaft, in 1945. Bottom line, what we can see so far in Britain and Switzerland, we can see the struggle against the Nazis, the fight against anti-Semitism, and the refugee work brings, for the first time in history, Jews and Christian as partners together, officially Jewish organizations and Christian organizations together, churches and synagogues working together hand in hand in these times of crisis. So we can see out of the crisis, out of the negative, at least something positive developed. And that was basically also put down in organizational forms in a common Jewish-Christian organization, either the British Council of Christian and Jews or the Swiss Christian-Jewish Working Committee. Now, those were the beginnings in Europe. But now, what happened in 1945? I said during the World War, obviously, there was no official cooperation possible in most of the European countries which were occupied by the Nazis. But what happened in 1945? And there came important help actually from the USA, from the United States. Long before official Christian and Jewish organizations in Europe, there was the National Council of Christians and Jews, founded in 1927 in the USA. And they actually visited the newly founded British Christian of Council and Jews already during the World War, and they discussed all kinds of matters, and there emerged the idea of an international Christian-Jewish conference after World War II, because partly now in other countries as well, in Canada, in Australia, in South Africa, for example, these organizations, Christian and Jewish organizations, were founded, and they thought it's time actually for an international conference. And the first international conference of Christian and Jews actually took place in 1946 in Oxford, in England, and the topic was freedom, justice, and responsibility. As you can see, it's more about politics, about society, about the human rights, about the human freedoms, about also freedom of religious as a human right. So this conference actually was also very important because it was kind of the start of an international cooperation that has not been before, and the different international groups started to become together. At the same time, there were representatives from several European countries, actually also from Czechoslovakia, and that actually, with also the help, organizational and financial help from the US, several Jewish Christian organizations were founded in the second part of the 1940s in all kinds of European countries, from Germany and the Netherlands, Belgium, France, and also in Eastern Europe. Now, the Christian-Jewish reconciliation became also part of the re-education and democratization program of the American Army. So especially in Germany, the Americans actually kind of took this idea from this conference and also the Seelisberg conference and took it into action and started to found Christian-Jewish organizations all over Germany. And finally, in Oxford in 1946, since anti-Semitism was such a big problem and not solved yet, was decided to hold an emergency conference on anti-Semitism. And that was actually the 1947 conference of Seelisberg. Now, I would like to make a short excursion in between with the situation in Czechoslovakia. A Christian Jewish organization was actually founded in Prague in 1947. And not only in Czechoslovakia, but actually all over Eastern Europe also, all kinds of Jewish Christian organizations were founded in Hungary, in Yugoslavia, in Poland, in Bulgaria, in Romania. But most of these organizations, and that also actually happened to the Christian Jewish organization in Czechoslovakia, when communists were taking over, the work was restricted and finally came to an end. In Czechoslovakia, the official end was actually 1950. So already since February 1948, the work became much more difficult, but in 1950, it completely deceased. And that was actually similar in other Eastern European countries. Unfortunately, actually, I personally don't know too much about the story. I found a small history of Christian Jewish organizations in Eastern Europe, but I think there is still a lot of work to do in all of Eastern Europe about these pioneers of Christian Jewish cooperation in Eastern Europe. So maybe somebody is interested to do more research here. Especially Czechoslovakia had good relations to Western countries such as Britain and Switzerland. And I know from letters that actually Switzerland did support, for example, the Swiss Christian Jewish organization did support the Czechoslovak chapter. And even the newly formed International Council of Christian Jews regarded Czechoslovakia as an important country in Eastern Europe, maybe even a bridge to the other Eastern European countries in the Christian Jewish work. So obviously there was a readiness and an openness, and there were, of course, at least until 1948, Czechoslovakia was less communist dominated than other Eastern European countries. Now, of course, we know the end of the story. Unfortunately, it did change then in 1950. But otherwise, yeah, maybe Czechoslovakia could have played a big role, an important role. Now, I could find out who was invited to the Seelisberg conference in 1947 and who was there. First, I would like to mention those who were invited but did not come. And maybe you would be surprised. Jan Masaryk, for example, was invited, the foreign minister. He did not come. I don't know why he did not come, but I know he was invited. Then František Fuchs was invited. As far as the information I have, maybe you know more about it actually, because I'm not the expert on Czechoslovak Jewish history. He was the kind of the president or somebody important in the Federation of the Jewish Communities of the Czechoslovakia at that time. It was also invited Erik Kolar, it was Jiří Romada, Professor František Bednar, and also a Jewish representative from Bratislava. I read a note which was written on the invitation list that there was a Jewish representative from Bratislava invited, but unfortunately I don't know the name. Maybe it was Benjamin Eichler, but I'm not sure about it. But I just know he did not show up at the end. But who was coming to Seelisberg? There were actually 3 Czechs who participated. Unfortunately, there are no Slovak. One was Dr. Thomas Berman, who was in the board or the president of the Jewish community of Prague at that time. Then Jiřina Tomova, who was the secretary of the Pen Club of Prague or Czechoslovakia, and then Bishop Miroslav Novak, a Protestant bishop, actually, who participated and who also from Prague, actually, who played kind of an important or not unimportant role, let's say. There was also somebody else from Prague. I didn't mention here, I will mention him later, but he was actually not Czech, but Scottish. Just was located in Czechoslovakia. Now, the Seelisberg Conference of 1947, there were 5 commissions. First, the principal objectives of Jewish-Christian cooperation in relation to combating of anti-Semitism, so the principles of anti-Semitism. Second, educational opportunity in schools and universities. Third, the task of the churches. Fourth, work in the field of civic and social service. And fifth, relations with governments. Now, what is very important about this Seelisberg Conference, and you can see it already from the commissions, it was not a religious dialogue conference, but it was actually a conference on anti-Semitism and how to combat anti-Semitism on all levels. And it's interesting, if you look at the participation of the organizers, where they actually put whom in which commission, you will quickly realize that theology was not regarded as the most important issue. And yeah, there was this commission, the task of the churches, but there was actually, you can see it in the preparation and the organization, all the big people, the important people, the VIPs, they were actually in other commissions, not in this one. And it seems that the organizers did not expect too much from the theological parts. Now, at the end, we know, of course, this was probably the most important commission of the Conference of Seelisberg. So that's why I want to concentrate a little on this commission. Chairman was Reverend Father Lopineau. He was basically the representative of the Vatican. He was originally French, Caïste Lopineau from Lyon, but he worked for the Vatican, and the vice chairman was the Czech Bishop Miroslav Novak. As you can see, relatively prominent in this commission. Although, unfortunately, I have to tell you, I don't know too much about him or what he said, what he did participate. I could not reconstruct that. But maybe there is somebody who speaks Czech or Slovak and can do some more research about it. The secretary was Dr. Allen from Great Britain. And then if you look at the members, there was Professor Bickel from Zurich, from Switzerland, Mademoiselle Davy, a Catholic young woman from France, from a university, Father Desmonts from Belgium. Desmonts was actually originally Jewish and converted to Catholicism, and worked during the Second World War in refugee work, rescuing Jews in Belgium. Then Pastor Freudenberg from Switzerland, originally from Germany, a member of the Confessing Church, and he organized the refugee work for the World Council of Churches in Switzerland. Professor Jules Isaac from France, important Jewish scholar. Abbé Journet, the later Cardinal Charles Journet from Fribourg, from Switzerland. Rabbi Joseph Kaplan, at that time the deputy chief rabbi of France. Later he became the chief rabbi of France. He has been active in Jewish-Christian relations for a longer time, even before the war. Reverend Father de Menasque from Fribourg, also in Switzerland, the same circles as Journet, originally also Jewish and a convert to Catholicism. Dr. Newlin from Switzerland, Rabbi Rosenblum from the USA, and then Reverend Robert Smith, as I said, from Czechoslovakia, officially. So 2 Czechs in this commission, although he was actually Scottish, part of the mission of the Scottish Church in Prague. And Rabbi Taubes, the chief rabbi of Zurich in Switzerland, an Orthodox rabbi, and very important, also one of the forces of Christian-Jewish cooperation in Switzerland, and the founder of the organization, of the Christian-Jewish organization in Switzerland. Now, how did the famous 10 points of Seelisberg come about? now we know these are tremendously important theological statements, and they had an impact not only at their time, but it was the base for all of the dialogue as we know it today. And therefore we can really say it was a founding moment of dialogue, the acceptance of these 10 points of Seelisberg. And actually the 10 points of Seelisberg were also the basic principles of that was what was later in Vatican II, in the Second Vatican Council, was passed as Nostra Aetate, as the kind of the Catholic change of attitude towards Jews and the Jewish people. Now, this commission was certainly no sure success, but on the contrary, it was really a very difficult task to bring all the different ideas and backgrounds together. Now, what was the base of the later statement? Many don't know. There were 18 points presented by Jules Isaac, and Jules Isaac, who was active in Christian-Jewish reconciliation in France, he discussed his book, Jesus and Israel, Jésus et Israël, with other Jews and also Catholics, and they kind of put together these 18 points as kind of a reader's digest of his books, of his thesis, and that was the base. Now, out of this, a draft was phrased, and it was discussed separately by the Jews and Christian denominations, first together, then separately, and then after a further common discussion and consensus and some changes, it was finally approved, and then it was actually put to the General Assembly of the conference and also confirmed later on. But as I said, it was a difficult path, and there were many conflicts. One conflict line was actually within the Catholic representatives of this delegation. That was L'Opinion and Desmond on the one hand, and Journet and de Menasque on the other hand. Journet and de Menasque from Switzerland, actually all of these four were French-speaking, but Journet and de Menasque from the French-speaking part of Switzerland, they were quite progressive, and they wanted to go really a step further, and they really were ready to go for a big change in Catholic theology towards Jews. They were influenced, for example, or were in touch with John Österreicher, who was also actually a Jewish convert to the Catholic faith, and who was later very important also together with Cardinal Beer for Vatican II, for Nostra Aetate, and or from Jacques Maritain, for example, who was the French ambassador to the Holy See. And now they were experienced in what happened with the deportations of the Jews in France, and they know that sometimes the Catholic Church actually blocked their willingness to help, and they didn't have always a good experience in that. That's why they were maybe much more open also to take responsibility from the church side what happened. Now L'Opinion and Desmond, they tried more to put into focus what the church, the Catholic Church, actually did and achieved during the Second World War. And it was true that, for example, L'Opinion, he was helping Jews in concentration camps in Italy, and Desmond was helping Jews to hide in monasteries in Belgium. So it is true that they were helping, but they maybe they did not, in their experience, they did not experience that was what Journet and de Menasque experienced, and that is kind of also anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish stereotypes within the church, and also church circles who did not want to support church and Jews and actually worked against it. Journet and de Menasque, they were actually not happy with L'Opinion, and we can see it in letters actually, especially Journet is quite critical with l'opinion. Let's leave it with that. Now, on the other hand, there was also a conflict between l'opinion and Kaplan, and that is about the content. L'opinion wanted to say that Christians made some mistakes in the past, and they should actually kind of admit the mistakes they did. But on the other hand, he wanted that the Jewish side writes something similar, so that Jews actually confess their mistakes towards Christianity, and that they would not teach that any longer in Jewish schools, for example. Now, Kaplan and the other Jewish representatives were shocked by this demand, because they said, we are not dealing kind of a quid pro quo, and we cannot say anything that has not happened, because actually Christianity was mostly not a part of Jewish law and Jewish education. So for what should we excuse if we actually didn't have it in our educational programs? So at the end of the day, to make it short, there was a compromise found, and both were happy. But this was a point about discussing responsibilities and discussing steps forward. We could see that this commission was nearly splitting, and it might have never come to the 10 points. But according to what Jeunet and also Kaplan remembered, it was de Menasque who was kind of helping to facilitate in important points kind of compromise. Now, finally, these 10 points, as I said, were confirmed by the General Assembly, and then it was sent out to high Christian institutions, and also the Vatican, for example, and the World Council of Churches agreed or confirmed this. This does not mean that they made it to their own position papers, and we know that it took the Vatican another 20 years until then in the Second Vatican Council it was mirrored in Nostra Aetate. But at least the Vatican officially allowed the Catholic delegates for themselves to sign this 10 points of Seelisberg, and they were not generally against these 10 points. Now, after Seelisberg, the influence, the work was going further. An international council of Christians and Jews was established. An international cooperation deepened. There was another international conference in 1948 in Fribourg. And as I said already, many Christian Jewish organizations were founded all over Europe. And that was the base of what we have as Christian Jewish cooperation today in Europe. Theologically, it was also an important source for Nostra Aetate in the Second Vatican Council, but it was also discussed and an important source for all kinds of statements within Christian churches, different Protestant churches, for example, also the Protestant church in Germany, like the Schwalbacher Thesen, the Schwalbach thesis in the 1950s, and so on and so on. So it did have an important impact in the practical work and also theologically. I would like to end at this point because I can see I already spoke more than I wanted to speak, but I'm very happy if there are more questions or if there is a discussion. I'm very happy to answer the questions or to come into discussion with you. Thank you very much.